Forgotten Promises, Vermonters' Call for Investment in Community Living. Our film opens with a first-person point of view moving down a sterile hallway in an inpatient psychiatric unit. Plexiglass surrounds a desk, and we see two small rooms with only beds in the middle of them. The beds appear unmade.
Disability Rights Vermont is the protection and advocacy agency for the entire state of Vermont. We were compelled to do this documentary and try to address the issue of institutionalization over community services, because I've been with Disability Rights Vermont for over 13 years now, and the conversation on this topic has been the exact same. You and I and the majority of Vermonters enjoy freedoms and privileges every day, multiple times a day, that we simply take for granted and that other people deserve too, but aren't able to enjoy, merely because there's a lack of services in the community or there's a lack of supports and housing. We're hoping that this documentary will inspire people or outrage people to do something to change the mental health system and service delivery system for people with all types of disabilities throughout the state of Vermont. My name is Lindsay Owen, and I'm the Executive Director at Disability Rights Vermont.
How would you describe the current state of mental health and disability services in Vermont?
My name is Susan Aronoff, and I am the Policy Analyst and Senior Planner for the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. Currently in Vermont, there seems to be a real crisis in the availability of community supports and especially housing in the community for adults with disabilities. And this would be any kind of housing, housing with services, accessible housing, any kind of housing, and it's beyond a crisis. We know from a report we did that we need over 600 units of what we call service-supported housing, housing that comes with services for adults with developmental disabilities alone. So that doesn't include the housing needs of people with brain injuries or mental health issues and our seniors. So it's a real crisis in Vermont right now.
It's Gracie Kenyon Rudolph. I'm the lead coordinator for Connectabilities, which is a rebrand of OCCA here in Orleans County. The overwhelming majority of those who are living with disabilities throughout the state of Vermont is also tied to their geographic location. The amount of staffing, the quality of staffing, the amount of area community resources is reflected in the kinds of care that they have an option for. In areas, particularly such as ours, we're in Orleans County in the Northeast Kingdom, those options don't really exist. So I would say there's a huge challenge for those people living here, trying to get all of their needs met with proper support, far greater challenge.
So I'm Kirsten Murphy. I'm Executive Director of the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council, which is a public board created by federal law that works to improve the lives of Vermonters with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So Vermont was an early adopter of community-based services for people with developmental disabilities. We're the second state in the country to close our institution, the Brandon Training School for people with intellectual disabilities. We started out the gate strong with a really strong commitment to building that system, but very quickly the political will to invest in community-based care really fell off. The system is in a free fall. People are really not even close to receiving the things that they are entitled to or have been found to need, either because there's not enough workforce or because we don't have enough options for people. So really, it's gone from poor to crisis in the last few years.
Vermont's healthcare system is in crisis. Mental health, physical health, elder care, intellectual and developmental disability services are all being grossly neglected by the state of Vermont. Research exists to support the fact that investing in these supports and services and in these vulnerable populations is by far more fiscally responsible than what we are doing now, which is creating highly restrictive institutions at no benefit to anybody but exorbitant costs to the entire community.
My name is Brenda Siegel, and I am the Executive Director of End Homelessness Vermont and the founder. And I also am a consultant on issues around human services, for example, the overdose crisis, disability rights, child welfare, issues like that. We have a long history of institutionalizing people that are living with mental illness or living with disabilities, and it's something that we need to change. But for people that would like some treatment or inpatient treatment, that's also not available in our state right now. So it doesn't matter which avenue you're trying to access support, it doesn't exist at this time.
Can you explain the significance of the Olmsted decision and the ADA's integration mandate?
The United States Supreme Court, in its Olmsted decision, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act integration mandate, requires all states to allow people to live in the least restrictive setting available to meet their needs. That means that if someone can be served in the community, then they have a right to be served in the community. What is shocking and inexplainable to Disability Rights Vermont and many other advocacy organizations is that that's not what Vermont is doing, and it is able to evade accountability, hopefully until now. We know that there's a lack of other therapeutic options in our communities, and that's why the default is to place people in these highly restrictive environments. But that violates Olmsted and the integration mandate, and that's why we're creating this documentary today.
Vermont seems to have a real lack of understanding of the ADA and how disability is defined and our requirements, according to the federal law, about ensuring that we are following the ADA and the requirements of the ADA. And the Olmsted decision made it so that people were not allowed to be forced into institutionalization or nursing care facilities or assisted living. And in our work at End Homelessness Vermont, we frequently see people at risk of being denied emergency shelter because they turned down going into a nursing facility. And that type of manipulation, like you won't be sheltered, you can be outside, so we're not forcing you, is the same as forcing. If you're giving someone a false choice, you're still forcing them into that position.
I think that those living with disabilities still don't have the level of choices that are equal to and compared to mine, or yours, or the legislators. That if we ourselves had to exist within the limitations, as many of the folks who live here have to exist and choose among, we'd see greater change, certainly quicker change. We'd find more funding. We would find active, intentional ways of bridging for everybody, where instead of only some availabilities, only some supports, only certain hours, certain days, we would find a much more comprehensive, continual, easier way to live our lives in this kind of a rural community.
I'm Sarah Launderville. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Center for Independent Living, and we're a disability justice organization. When we talk about Olmsted and we talk about choices that people are supposed to have, what I think that was meant at that time was, let's build up a system so there are actual choices, not false choices, right? Like you can say that I want to live in the community, but then I don't have anybody to help support me while I'm in that community, or any of those other things that I have when I'm, I lived in a group home for a while, and so when I was in the group home, I had supports around me, right? I had somebody helping me with employment. I had a case manager. I had people that were helping with my mental health issues. And I, eventually wasn't going to be living there anymore and moving out. But if I didn't have support in community, then I likely wouldn't have moved out and been able to then go find a job and do all the other things that I needed to be able to do, to be able to live on my own. And so when you kind of create these systems where there's just not a choice, then people end up back in these restrictive settings because it's just not, it's not an actual choice, and it's not something, and they end up there, and then once again, all the feelings of living in a restrictive system and not living the lives that you want to live is exactly what happens to people.
I think it's really important to understand that just because, for example, someone is quadriplegic and in a wheelchair doesn't mean that they belong in an institution. they still can live in community-based living with community-based supports. We just have to make sure we have the right support and access for people who are living with disabilities in our state.
When the United States Supreme Court decided the Olmstead case, for people with disabilities, it was like our Brown versus Board of Education. It was like our Roe versus Wade. It just established for the first time that people with disabilities under federal law were entitled to the same kinds of basic civil rights protections, including the right to be free from segregation, being separated from people. And what the Supreme Court in Olmstead, the decision written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, really said to people with disabilities for the first time was, you're one of us. You need to be in the community with everyone else, not separated off into institutions. And what the Supreme Court said in Olmstead to the states was, if you have people who cannot take care of themselves such that the state has this duty to provide food, clothing, and shelter for some of its residents, if you're providing that level of care, right now you're providing it in an institution. If the person themselves would rather be in the community, and if they could safely live in the community, then it's their choice to receive that level of state support that they're entitled to by law in the community, not in an institution. It was game-changing. I can't even really express now, all 20 years later, how game-changing it was. But at the time, I was a practicing lawyer, and it just gave a whole generation of lawyers hope that we now had a tool to fight for the rights of the people with disabilities who were just being warehoused in institutions that were really sometimes very well-meaning, but often very dangerous and decrepit.
I look back to when the commission was formed to develop the Olmstead Plan in the state of Vermont, and I think there were a lot of really smart, good people that were on that commission, and they developed a plan that I think just got lost, right? Like that there's just, first of all, the plan itself is really kind of a manual on all the services that were around back when that plan was developed. And there's some good objectives. But, I sort of joke about this on a regular basis. If I was to take that plan and sort of what we have done with that over the years, then they would have, if I did the same thing when I put together my own plans for the organization, they would have taken my money away, right? Plans have to have some sort of accountability, some sort of way that we move those objectives forward, and those things haven't happened. I think ultimately, though, the drive and want to be in a place where we actually move the issues forward is where we all need to be. And I think that there's a lot of excuses of why we don't move forward. Some of it's about money, some of it's about workforce. But I think ultimately it's about lack of leadership and lack of how do we get to a place where we really believe that people with disabilities should be living in community, and not at a place where we're kind of just okay with just, being dispensable about people with disabilities.
Are there any personal stories that have particularly resonated with you and highlight the impact of Vermont's reliance on institutional care?
Disability Rights Vermont has had a number of individuals come to us needing less restrictive environments. We worked with one gentleman who was in prison for 2.5 years, longer than he needed to be, because there wasn't mental health supported housing in the community. Most individuals need to be in the community but are stuck in inpatient hospitalization settings. We've worked with folks who were in that situation for years, 2 years, and in one case, 4 years. And then for others, sometimes the state of Vermont magically finds the money and puts them in the community, and therefore the case is resolved. So inch by inch, we've been able to help a few individuals here and there, but the problem is so much bigger than that. And we really need to address this for all Vermonters across all disability types, because helping one individual at a time will not fix the system.
I'm Jack McCullough. I'm a lawyer at Vermont Legal Aid. And for about the last 30 years, I've been the director of our mental health law project. So I could think of one case where the state psychiatrist was saying that one of the reasons that the person, that our client was showing signs of mental illness was because every day he would show up at the police department and sign in. And the psychiatrist was thinking, well, that shows that he kind of thinks he's a member of the police department or something. In fact, he had conditions of release from a criminal charge that required him to go to the police department every day and sign in. So he wasn't going for some delusional reason. He was going because the court had ordered him to do that.
One comes when I was sort of new at this work. I ran what was called the Home Access Program. We provide grants for bathroom and entrance modifications for people with physical disabilities. And there was a woman who had multiple sclerosis. She was in her 40s. And her doctor said to her, "You really need to live in a nursing home." And because we're a peer-based organization, we had peer support talking with her about, well, what are the things, what are the components that make it so you should live in a nursing home? And they were not things that other people who had disabilities would say that land you in a nursing home, right? She had support around her. She had a house that she lived in. She had just had a home modification done. She had people in her life. But because of her diagnosis and because her physical body was getting to a place where the doctor was worried about her, the doctor just made this comment, "You should go in a nursing home." And she believed him, and she did. And she did that, and within a year called back and said, "I don't want to be here, I don't want to be here." And so we helped get her back out, get her set up back in community again. But just that one comment of how a doctor can be so influential on whether you're going to, how you decide how you're going to live was very impactful for me. And it kind of spearheaded for me, like, oh my gosh, this is awful.
I want to tell you just one story, but I think it is emblematic of what is happening for many, many people. And I'm going to try to protect the identity of this individual who unfortunately has experienced so much trauma that this individual was not willing to come forward for this project. This individual came up through the foster care system, does not have a family. She has very significant physical needs, mental health needs, and she has an intellectual disability. This individual, I did several home visits and came to notice that this individual was not being treated in ways that I consider to be, about basic dignity. She was being spoken about in the third person in her presence. Sometimes there was a locked door between the side of the house that was for this person and another individual. Didn't have access to food anytime she wanted it, which frankly is actually a regulation in Medicaid rules, right? If you're paying for these services with Medicaid. So over time, this individual became more and more depressed, understandably. And eventually this provoked a mental health crisis where this individual ended up in the emergency room. And for lack of any capacity, she stayed in the emergency room for 30 days. Not in the hospital, not in a hospital bed. They could not find any place for this individual. She spent 30 days in the emergency room. And she kept stating that she did not want to go back to this home provider. But she was finally discharged back to that home provider's care. And she proceeded to have more mental health issues, understandably, again, that resulted in this person trying to take flight. So if you can imagine a person who uses a chair trying to escape down a country road, that's essentially what happened. And this person ended up again for a 30-day stay in the emergency room. And then, for lack of better placements, spent a short amount of time in an elder care situation. And then when that wasn't working after a week, was placed in a downtown hotel in Burlington with a provider kind of coming in and out, nursing care and that sort of thing. In a hotel. That's not a home. And when the hotel needed the room, they kicked this person out. And this person's biggest trauma and fear was being homeless. So eventually, this was like months of this kind of unstable housing situation for someone with acute anxiety, depression, high nursing needs, and an intellectual disability. That is emblematic of the lack of capacity and choice and options to address not atypical needs of the population the state is required by law to serve.
These are our neighbors. And as soon as we start valuing every single person and giving every single person a seat at the table and the dignity and worth and support that we ourselves would be able to get, our work's not done.
We have an entire generation of adults, roughly my age, in their 50s and 60s, who are providing housing to their adult children, but they're adults with disabilities because there's no other place for them. There's no other place for them to live.
Joey's story.
My name is Lori Mumley, and this is my son, Joey, who is 22 years old. Joey loves singing and dancing and music and adaptive snowboarding and all sorts of different things like any 22-year-old. He's diagnosed autistic and has some specific communication challenges. He currently lives at home with me and his sister, who is a senior in high school. In terms of exhausted, I'm a single parent. My child has moderate to high support needs, meaning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I don't get breaks. The other parent is not involved at all, and things need to change here in Vermont. I know as an Agency of Human Services employee for many years, I heard time and time again about how Vermont was a leader and we were great in so many aspects. And sadly, I've found that we are way behind other states. The adult services system is atrocious. We should be a model for the rest of the country. We're small enough to really integrate developmental services across the board, and yet we don't. Services are all siloed, they're hard to access, and they really just don't exist. He just likes being busy and active, and he likes being social. I do get to listen to nice singing all day. Families like ours are often not seen because it's harder for us to get out in the community. It's 1,000 times more work to take somebody with a significant disability to ball games, concerts, other events that are community-wide. And I think sometimes people think that our families aren't here. We are here. We're in every community across the state. We exist. Our families don't have voices. We're burnt out and exhausted from providing 24/7 care for however many years our child has been alive. We're barely in survival mode. We don't really have the time or energy or means to get out there and tell our stories. I think that's starting to change out of desperation on the parents' part. We're going to die. I mean, not to be blunt, but we're going to die. We will not be here forever. My kid deserves a safe, stable, service-supported housing with peers before I die. That needs to happen. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Joeys across the state that need that. And I think the state needs to take the lead and push the designated agencies as a condition of their being designated agencies. They get money to provide services. I think part of the stipulations for getting that money, any money, should be you have to come up with at least to different options than what already exists, which is nothing.
Can you discuss the role of funding in these systemic issues? How does the current funding structure hinder or help the implementation of community-based supports?
I think the thing that would make the greatest difference in Vermont would be leadership at the top. And I would say that would start with a governor who wants to comply with the federal laws. Vermont is out of compliance with the laws that govern home and community-based services, and we have been for more than a decade, and we continue to fall further behind. So we're lacking leadership, and we're lacking leadership. The governor needs to pick a Secretary of Human Services who's committed to complying with the federal law, including Olmstead, and who's committed to shifting services and resources from institutional care to the community. We've seen in the last several legislative sessions proposals from the Agency of Human Services to put more and more people into institutional settings, juveniles, seniors with psychiatric conditions, people with developmental disabilities who are caught up with legal cases called a forensic facility. All of these proposals for institutional care, because we have not had leadership in developing community-based care, community-based alternatives, which aside from being what people want, are also less expensive. Everyone knows that, and yet without leadership at the top, commissioners at the departments, they can't make these kinds of changes. So they're kind of stuck, like middle managers are sometimes stuck, where they have all of the problems. All the people stuck in the hospital ERs go to the commissioner's level, but we need a governor and a Secretary of Human Services who are committed, who lead and are committed to following the law and committed to the goals of Olmstead and the Americans with Disabilities Act.
I think it's important to notice that Vermont has spent considerable political capital and money on healthcare reform, because we're aware that our healthcare system is quite expensive compared to other states. And we've made this crucial mistake, right, in focusing healthcare reform on hospitals and on hospital systems, right? And we are now in a position where we really haven't been able to move the needle on cost or quality or the health of our population. Also, it's important to notice that people with disabilities, they're the largest health disparity population in the United States, right? It's a big population, and there's a Vermont study from 2018 that demonstrates that people with disabilities have 2 to 2.5 times the rate of pretty much any disease that you can name. All right, so diabetes, heart disease, cancers, COPD, all higher for people with disabilities, 2 to 2.5 times higher, right? So this is a population that are heavy users of hospital systems, but we could help those people stay out of the hospital if we had a quality community care, support around them, right? We hear these stories all the time of, someone with, debilitating asthma, and what's needed is that they need a mattress that isn't moldy, right? There are fixes, right? But we haven't focused on what's happening for real people in real time where they live. We focused on what happens in the hospital when they're already quite sick.
One of the weaknesses in the financing system that supports these services is that unlike all other parts of the healthcare system, whether it's the hospital workforce or the nursing home workforce, those workforces receive annualized raises. The Green Mountain Care Board reviews the budgets of every hospital, and in their hospital budget reports, they build in pay raises for their entire workforce. They all can count on a cost of living increase at a minimum. The way that we fund our Medicaid services in Vermont is really through a contract negotiation between the Agency of Human Services and service providers it contracts with. And what happens every year in the legislature, it's kind of like Groundhog's Day all over again. Most administrations, it doesn't matter if they're Democrats or Republicans, in the governor's recommended budget, this whole service system that we're talking about is level funded. And so every year the advocates have to gear up and work really hard to get some kind of an increase. Last year it was 3%, but that doesn't keep pace with inflation. And that's nothing that the people who work in this system can plan on going forward. It's just no way to run a donut shop. And this is the way that we're running the services that provide Vermonters with most significant level of disabilities are the only ones who are eligible for these home and community-based services that we're talking about. That story just repeats over and over again, and that simple fix of an annualized rate increase for the Medicaid-funded service providers, that could probably go a long way. But this isn't just a money issue, it's a leadership issue.
Can you tell me about what your life was like before moving into a nursing home?
Hello, my name is Reverend Mike Grudica. I live currently right now at Pine Heights at Brattleboro. I lived up in Derby Line. I used to be able to go to church occasionally, go to the library. I used to travel to meetings often, or when I wasn't at meetings, I would be on the phone with one of our friends from the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. So I had a fairly active life, not only being on the phone, but being a ham radio operator as well. I tried to have as full a life as a person can have who is disabled. The only reason that I'm down here is the lack of health care that I needed, because I had a problem with my hips at one point and I couldn't get up on my own and I needed more health care. And even my cousin, who is now my legal guardian, she wanted me originally to stay in my apartment where it's cheaper and where I knew everybody, than to come down here where I didn't know anybody. But the only reason I came down here was, I think, because she did extensive research and she had more time to devote to this than did the social worker up in North Country Hospital. I didn't get the health care I needed at home. That's why she was looking for a nursing home. She didn't want to put me in one. She would have rather I stay in my apartment where I knew everybody. I would like to see him put more money into healthcare and say more money where it comes to hiring people that want to work in healthcare. And maybe you might have more people that lived at home and less in nursing homes. When I fell originally, I was so weak that they didn't want me to try to get up and go to bed. So for like 2 weeks, I slept in my wheelchair because they didn't think I was stable enough to do transfers. They didn't have the health care they should have had. Well, when VNA did have enough staff, which is ironically 2 weeks later, the second time I fell, they did have enough staff, but I would have to be in bed like 5:30, 6 o'clock, because that's when they had this staff person that was able to do it. So that's when I went to bed, and maybe 12 and a half hours later I get up. And this one person I had for 7 years. The reason that some of my staff left is because they weren't getting paid what they needed to get paid. At least this is what I was told by them. They needed to find a better paying job. So I'm going to say right here that home health doesn't get paid enough.
Home-based care is challenging. There are a lot of really incredible people who are skilled at their work, but they're not paid well. there aren't enough of those workers. It's hard to attract and retain them. And then there's requirements of what they can and can't do that sometimes leave people who would prefer community-based living without a support they need. For an example that I can give is we had a client who needed eye drops put in, and the home-based care was not allowed to put the eye drops in. But he had limited mobility in his arms, which meant he couldn't put them in himself. And it can't be that the only solution, because somebody couldn't put eye drops in for him, is that he has to be in an institution.
It is an absolutely daunting job. It requires not only initial training, but ongoing training. It also requires that the remuneration reflect the difficulty. It's not just physical, although the physical demands are significant. It requires better pay, better significant acknowledgement, better training, better recruitment, better supervision. It is absolutely not happening now. So what ends up happening is there are huge gaps of care. So if I'm a person living with a significant disability that requires an attendant, a helper, and they can't show up, there is no fallback. There are no other folks who are waiting in line to fill in that absence. So I may have an entire shift where there is no one coming in. So things like using the restroom might be impossible. Transferring from where I am to where I need or want to be, impossible. If an emergency arose, I may not be able to get someone that I physically need to address that emergency for me and access other kinds of services. And that happens all the time. They're the last to get what they need, and you can't give away what you yourself are not getting. So if we want to make a real investment in our population that we're serving with disabilities, we need to make a real investment in care provision. And that includes the very important, very much needed personal care attendants and certified nurse assistants.
The designated agencies really need to step it up. There needs to be a better plan other than, oh, well, every time we don't have staff, they'll just get nothing. No, that's not actually an option. It should never have been an option. And unfortunately, it is. And Vermont is breaking the parents. Absolutely breaking us.
Joseph's story.
My name is Patricia Waite, and I am Joseph Waite's mother and also his co-guardian.
And I'm Jared Waite. I'm Joseph's older brother and his co-guardian.
Joseph is my second son. He was born 41 years ago. He was diagnosed immediately with Down syndrome, and a year later he was diagnosed with a very severe seizure disorder called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Very difficult to control seizures, all different kinds of seizures, and that diagnosis also led to further delay developmentally and physically for him. Over the last 41 years, he's had surgeries, seizures, been in different homes, and is currently living in his own apartment that we provide for him with 24/7 care. The decision for him to leave and make that leap from living at home with his family into the shared living provider system was not something that we anticipated. Because of a breakup in our family unit, I was not able to take care of him by myself, so he went out into the shared living community part-time and then full-time. My expectations were that people would do what they said they were going to do to take care of him. They would follow instructions, that he would have a lifestyle in the manner of care similar to what he had experienced. It was pretty shocking. That was the first home that we had to remove him from because he had an unexplained 20-pound weight loss. The home was quite dirty. There were too many people in the home for, I think, your shared living providers at the time were supposed to only have 2 people living with them, and there were closed doors. There were animals. I believe that family the home was closed after we removed. We kind of focused on that and removed Joseph. For basically, that one was kind of neglect and unexplained neglect. When our next placement, I was hoping, oh, okay, this isn't going to happen again because these things have been brought to light. These are the expectations. People are going to know. The next home was actually worse. He had physical abuse. Probably a similar amount of neglect, but in a way that you didn't really see it. And he was removed from that home as well. And for physical, he was disheveled all the time. He was dirty. He smelled. He wasn't being bathed. That home was also closed after we removed him. And in between these placements too, he came back and lived with me. So he did have a place to settle. He didn't have to go into any kind of emergency placement. So, and there would be maybe a year in between some of these placements to find another one. It's what happens when the parent or the guardian or whatever supervisors walk out the door. That's what concerns me. And the fact that Joseph is the most vulnerable of our citizens. Yeah, he cannot speak or indicate in any way. The third home is where he had both of his hands broken, and there was no one knew how that happened. He was also removed from that home. It's infuriating to me, as well as just this. I apologize to him. I'm sorry, Joseph. I'm so sorry.
And I think to add to the most recent example, he had pressure wounds or bed sores, open wounds, and we had to address those. So there was a physical healing, and in that process, bacteria, fecal matter, entered the wound, which led to a bloodborne infection.
Yes.
That radiated down to his leg. So there was the original pressure wounds and bed sores, and then there was a secondary infection because of that. So all said and done, it was 8 to 10 weeks of hospital visits, doctor's visits, that could have led to sepsis, septic shock, in a very serious situation with his medical situation and fragility. So the things that arise and the neglect that originates over here can translate into something very serious quite quickly for someone like him.
And I'll just add one point to that is there's a money connection to that.
Yeah.
A well-trained person with possibly even some kind of a certificate needs to be paid well to do that kind of job. Always the wages, people that have come in and out of Joseph's life through the agency with the hourly pay they get and whatever, they move on. They're not funded correctly. They're not valued in their paychecks.
I think that's a really good point. I think that below the nursing credential, personal care attendants, LNAs, folks doing direct service and direct care with elderly patients or people like Joseph doing the hard work are compensated the least. There's certainly a compensation factor. I think that there is a recognition and professionalism component to it as well. So recognizing that this work is important and valuable, and sometimes that recognition can be through pay. I think maybe a certification process, but also from society, some recognition that this is important work, taking care of people who are vulnerable, either because of their disability or because of their age or because of an accident. We're all going to be there, and none of these problems are going away. Seeing him with broken hands or in the ICU or frankly from all these preventable things, like he didn't have to be there if the basics were met, right? His basic care or basic supervision or just basic maintenance of him throughout the day. He probably could have avoided, I don't know, the vast majority of all these incidents And so when you see him in that place, how long has this happened? How long has this been going on? And, you know, from my perspective, I see the impact on him and the impact on my mom. And, you know, it's very hard.
How is the lack of community investment impacting the homeless community?
The majority of people who are experiencing homeless have some sort of disability. We've been working on this issue and advocating against some of the changes that are in policy that are happening right now, including no longer making disability a priority to be in emergency housing, which is coming true today. So we have a huge issue. One of the things we've been combating is that is this reliance on, well, there are nursing homes that those people can go into. And so knowing that sort of the underlying thought around how we think about people with disabilities, that we can say, okay, nursing homes are an adequate way to house somebody versus looking at a holistic approach. And because we're looking at things from this place of, well, there's not enough money, there's not enough housing, there's not enough this, there's not enough that. And that whole scarcity model kind of gets us to this place of it's okay to then put somebody in an institution because that's better than living on a street for somebody. And I can tell you hands down that all of those legislators, all those policymakers have never lived in an institution if that's what they think. So I think that that's kind of absurd. And I think that it continues to perpetuate these myths around disability and how people with disabilities we can be in the community.
We open up on a sign on a building that labels it as another way. 3 people walk down the hill towards the building.
Hi, my name is Sade Holmes. I come here every day to take a shower, eat, and take care of little bit things on the computer, or just relax and listen to music. But that's why I'm here today. I had to come take a shower and get dressed because I'm homeless at the moment. I don't live at the hotels because they say that there's no rooms across the whole state. That's how bad it is. Originally, how I became homeless is because I rented my apartment for 14 years in Hardwick, and we had a storm last July. And so my house, it wasn't condemned, but it wasn't livable because of the black mold that was caused by the water. So the state, Vermont, was paying for my hotel room, I guess. I paid some, and then they paid some. And I was doing that since February of 2024. Last month, they said they wasn't going to renew my room, so I had to leave. I had never been in a situation like this, and then how I'm in this situation, it's very hurtful to see how people treat homeless people. Life is traumatizing alone by itself. Why add to it? Things have to change because it's wrong what these people are doing to homeless people. I don't know, maybe they can, some of these old homes that's condemned, they can start fixing them up and hiring homeless people. Because just because you don't have a place to live don't mean you don't work. I go to work. I go to work every 3 days.
My name is Seth Collins. There are members of our Another Way community that have been searching for housing for years. And there are members that were recently displaced by the pandemic and the flooding. It's important that new housing be built because there are individuals that are, it's sad to say, but there are individuals that are suffering they're suffering in horrific elements. They're suffering in floods, in rains, and snows, and they simply need housing that is affordable. When I say affordable, I mean in the range of $500 per month, because simply these individuals cannot afford the price of the current Montpelier housing, and there aren't even enough apartments at the standard price point. So there need to be more apartments that are in the $500 range per month, and so that's what I would like to say to any politicians hearing this. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nolan Carver. These challenges are seen as difficult challenges, but they're also are relatively simple solutions. So it just means putting our backbone behind our belief system and acting from a place of abundance instead of a place of greed or fear.
What do you believe are the biggest gaps or barriers to robust community-based services?
So if we want really good care, really adequate response to the needs of our community members, funding has to be absolutely increased. We need to look at what are our priorities, who are our priorities, and where is the money going? Is it being well spent? How do we actually track that, which is going to take an outside resource to evaluate and make recommendations that are specific to the needs of the community.
Then there's decision points, right? There's decision points of the hospital gets to make of whether they're going to institutionalize you voluntarily, or you get to, quote, decide if it's voluntarily. And I've been through these systems in my personal life where the decision doesn't really feel like a decision, right? Like it isn't a choice. It's you get to go to this other restrictive environment, or you get to go home, but you have to sort of go through those hoops. Say then you're shipped off to then the Brattleboro Retreat or another institutional setting, and the people in the emergency department have promised that you're going to receive additional care. You're going to get care there. That's not true either. You're going to be in a different restrictive environment where they're going to make sure that you're not harming yourself. That's not care. That's making sure that you're just safe in that moment. And the promises that are made at each of those sections is never true. You might get released, you might not get released immediately, but when you get released, what's out there in the community? And that's where we should have been thinking, number one. What was out in the community to begin with? It wasn't helping us, so we ended up in that emergency spiral system. So then somebody is put back into the community and allowed to be living again in community, and the resources aren't there that they needed to begin with. And so we kind of just keep shifting back and forth. And there's multiple problems with that, right? We're not funding systems that might be stronger or better. We're not building new systems because we're doing just sort of what we always do. And that's, partially a state issue. It's partially a hospital issue. It's partially, a community environment issue. And then it's fed in from other problems. Poverty plays into it. Homelessness plays into it, like all of those things. So it's one of those things that, if we don't really get to the place where we're actually doing something around community, then we're never going to solve this issue. And we're just going to keep living in that cycle over and over again.
What is your message to policymakers and the general public regarding the urgent need for mental health and disability services reform in Vermont?
In our wrongly confined report, we highlight the dramatic difference between the cost of housing someone in an institution versus serving somebody in the community. That difference back in 2020 was roughly $2,500 to serve somebody in an institution or in a hospital for a day, and $64 to serve somebody in the community. When we think about investing $23 million to lock away our children who are in greatest need, we could be doing an enormous amount of work and supporting kids in their own homes, with their own families, around their own friends, for many, many, many more kids than the 41 beds that are being proposed. 41 beds, $23 million.
I think my message to policymakers and people in leadership is to really take an active listening on the people with disabilities in the community with lived experience. And I think I almost kind of roll my eyes in saying that because we've been saying that for a really, really long time. And people sit on advisory committees and they do a lot of work, and we spend a lot of time sharing our opinions and our experiences. And the next part, that leap between making it reality, doesn't always move. And that's what I'd like to see happen. I'd like to see something move, a little bit quicker than what we're seeing. But I think that if you're a policymaker and you're brand new at this, like really engaging with the actual community that are experiencing things and not being defensive around it, right? Like there's so much stuff around either hospital systems or even people within the administration being defensive because they don't want to believe that these things are accurate and true, but they are. Like, these are the harms and the experiences that people with disabilities are having. And so how do we move to something different?
All of us who are providers and working with people who are living with disabilities and living with mental illness are drowning. It is work that lasts long past 40 hours a week for almost everyone doing it. And we can't get people what they need. And we're watching people struggle because we can't get them what they need. And a big portion of that is because not only are we not funded for it, but also we cannot attract and retain workers at the level of funding that people are able to pay their staff.
If I could speak directly to legislators and policymakers and the people, I would tell them a lot, but I would tell them some of the changes that they need to make now are increasing the Medicaid rates for direct support workers. They need to be creative how staffing works. They need to change the licensing regulations to reflect what the housing needs are. They need to fund these things. There really should be actual disability services in this state. All of our kids need appropriate, stable, service-supported housing.
Now is the time for change. Now is the time for accountability. Now is the time for Vermont to do better by all of its residents. Investing in the mental health and the overall health of all of Vermonters at the earliest possible time is the best way to make sure that Vermonters are able to be successful and that Vermont will be, again, a community that people want to live in and that people want to stay in.
As we look to the future, what are the most critical steps that need to be taken to ensure that Vermonters with disabilities can live in the least restrictive environment possible?
I think the law is there. We have the law under Olmsted, under Vermont statutes. The law is there that the state's required to serve people in the least restrictive setting. Whether the resources are there to enable that to happen is the big question.
Moving forward, the things that I think of within our systems that need to change, I think to tie it back to Olmsted and the Olmsted decision and the plan is maybe we need to just have a revitalization of what does it look like right now in 2024, leaning into 2025, in a world where we know the state is in crisis around so many issues and it feels so big, but maybe we step back and instead of just analyzing all of the bad, but say, okay, if we did X, Y, and Z, those things would really shift this little tiny part, and let's start rolling with that and making those changes. I think that those are some of the things that need to happen.
And I'm hoping that this documentary will really inspire legislators and all community members to seriously question our policymakers, and everyone should be asking questions about what the state has already done to try to provide services at a lower level of care. What has already been done to try to meet this need in the community as required under the law?
I think going forward, there are several crucial steps that need to be taken so that Vermonters with disabilities can live in the most integrated settings and have choice as to where they live. And I think there are some simple things that need to happen on a statewide level, and one of those is something like requiring that all of the housing that's invested in with public dollars, like through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, be accessible, and that there be priority given and set-asides in every new housing project that's constructed. A reasonable number of units ought to be set aside for people with disabilities. There was some legislation passed. This is a game changer. It sort of seems so obvious, but it took an act of the Vermont legislature to make it happen, which is now the housing authorities throughout the state have to give priority to people with disabilities when they're renting out apartments that are actually physically accessible. because that accessible housing stock in Vermont right now is so limited, it makes sense to try to pair people up who need accessible apartments with the accessible apartments that are in the public housing stock. So that there are changes happening like that, moving in the right direction. More of that has to happen. Every single new housing project that's going up needs to meet the needs of people with disabilities. And then in addition to that, that annualized rate reviews, and if indicated rate increases for the service providers. This can't be the only system that doesn't get annualized rate increases. We will never solve the workforce crisis without annualized rate increases, and without a qualified, trained, happy, sustainable workforce, people will not be able to live quality lives in the community. So we have the housing challenge we have to solve, and the workforce challenge, but we can't solve them one and then the other. We have to do both of those things together.
Imagine yourself as someone all of a sudden being limited by some of the disabilities that are being featured in this film. If this was you, what would you hope would happen? Set that as the bar. If this was happening to your child, to someone you loved, someone you valued, someone you respected and admired, what would you want to see? Set that as the bar. And then make decisions accordingly. And don't just make the decisions, but make those decisions, write those checks, make the policy, address the laws, enact them, but be very involved in the community to see, is it working?
All I'd say is that my life would improve a lot more if you could find cheaper solutions so I could move the hell out of here and back into the community where I would like to be again, because I think by being here I can't do what I'd like to do. I can't be a contributing member of Vermont society. So I'd say, get me the hell out of here. And that's all.